The sun rose over the sprawling fields of the Mississippi Delta, the light breaking across rows of cotton that stretched farther than the eye could see. Yet for those who worked the land, the horizon was a boundary of suffering, not freedom. The earth beneath their feet, red and stubborn, clung to the calloused hands of the laborers who bent over it from dawn until dusk, their bodies moving with mechanical precision. The rhythm dictated not by the seasons, but by the whip and the crack of the overseer's voice. Among them, Sarah moved quietly, her small frame seeming almost invisible amid the throng of laborers. Yet her mind and spirit carried a fire that none of her masters could extinguish. Born on this plantation, her earliest memories were of the same brutal routine. The relentless sun, the merciless lash, the whispered prayers that passed from one slave to another like sacred secret messages. Even as a child, she had learned the code of survival, reading the subtle signals in the eyes of those around her, learning when to bend and when to hide, when to speak and when to remain silent. She had seen family torn apart, children sold downriver to distant plantations, mothers mourning quietly in corners as though grief itself were a crime. These early experiences were etched into her consciousness, forming the backbone of a courage that would later define her. The plantation house loomed above the fields, a stark symbol of power and ownership, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the morning sun, its wide veranda a stage from which her master and his family observed the daily labor. Within those walls, the cruelties were often subtler but no less devastating. Humiliations designed to remind the enslaved of their place, manipulations that pitted family members against each other, and punishments that left invisible scars, permanent yet unacknowledged. Sarah understood this landscape intimately, not only through direct experience but through observation of the suffering of others. Women stripped of dignity, men broken by relentless demands, children indoctrinated into servitude before they could even speak. She had learned to see the patterns, to anticipate the violence, and to find small, hidden moments of resistance. A seed hidden in a pocket, a whispered story of hope shared at night, a tear wiped from a child's face without the overseer noticing. These acts, though small, were the threads of defiance that would grow into something larger, something that could challenge the very system that sought to crush her. By 1849, Sarah was a young woman, her body hardened by years of labor, her mind sharpened by the constant necessity of survival. She had witnessed enough cruelty to know that fear was a tool her masters wielded skillfully, yet she had also witnessed moments that defied despair. Clandestine gatherings where songs of freedom were sung softly, messages conveyed through quilts and coded stories, the quiet bravery of those who dared to hope. Among the enslaved community, she had gained a reputation for both intelligence and subtle cunning. She could navigate the treacherous terrain of plantation politics, understanding the overseer's moods, the master's whims, and the unspoken hierarchies that governed life beyond the field. Her awareness was not just a means of survival, it was a form of power, latent and dangerous, a power that could shift the balance in a world built on fear. The plantation records, meticulously maintained by the master's clerks, represented more than mere bookkeeping. They were instruments of control. Every name, every mark of debt or punishment, every note of sale or transfer was a thread in the web that bound the enslaved to the land. These records ensured that the system of ownership remained intact, that the human cost of profit remained invisible to the wider world, and that resistance could be traced and punished before it gained momentum. Sarah understood the significance of these documents, not merely as symbols but as tools that, if destroyed, could disrupt the machinery of oppression. The idea was dangerous, almost unthinkable, yet in her mind, the possibility began to take shape. The risk was immense, but the reward, the liberation of self, the assertion of agency, even if only temporary, was a fire she could not ignore. Evenings on the plantation carried a different weight than the oppressive daylight hours. Shadows lengthened across the fields, and the voices of the enslaved softened into a chorus of whispered confidences, muted laughter, and songs that blended sorrow and hope. In these moments, Sarah felt a flicker of autonomy, a sense that the world could be understood and perhaps subtly reshaped. It was in these times that plans began to form in secret. She had learned from older members of the community about the underground networks, the faint rumors of safe houses along the river, the stories of those who had escaped northward. Each tale was a thread in a tapestry of knowledge, each story a cautionary lesson, yet each also a spark of inspiration. The records kept by the master's clerks became, in her imagination, targets of a different kind of labor, one aimed at disruption, at sending a message that the enslaved were not passive, that their will could not be fully contained. As the year progressed, tensions on the plantation increased. The national discourse over slavery was becoming louder, more contentious, and whispers of abolitionist sentiment filtered into even the most remote corners of the South. Masters and overseers grew increasingly anxious, and the violence inflicted upon the enslaved intensified in response, a grim calculus designed to suppress any thought of defiance. Sarah, aware of the heightened scrutiny, adjusted her behavior outwardly to avoid suspicion, yet inwardly, the resolve that had been building over years hardened into decisive determination. She began to observe patterns in the work schedules, in the comings and goings of clerks and overseers, in the times when the house fell quiet and when it was vigilant. Every observation was a piece of the larger puzzle, a step toward an act that would leave an indelible mark on the history of the plantation, even if history itself rarely recorded the courage of those enslaved. Nightfall brought its own perils. Lanterns swung from the veranda, casting long, flickering shadows. Overseers patrolled with suspicion sharpened by fear of insurrection, and dogs were released to patrol the boundaries. Yet within this environment, Sarah's ingenuity thrived. She discovered concealed pathways, learned to move in near silence, and developed a network of trusted confidants who could provide critical information. The plantation, with its vast fields, hidden corners, and labyrinthine structures, became both a prison and a theater of possibility. Each day, as she performed her labor with apparent compliance, her mind rehearsed the steps that might one day allow her to strike back, to assert agency in a world that had denied her so much. The act she envisioned, burning the plantation records, was not merely symbolic. It was a direct challenge to the system, a moment of defiance that would erase the documentation of ownership, and in doing so, claim a small victory for those who had been denied any measure of control over their lives. In the quiet hours before dawn, Sarah often reflected on the lives that had been extinguished too soon, the families torn apart, the children who would never know the warmth of their mother's embrace. Each memory was a layer of grief, yet each also became a source of motivation. The act she was planning carried immense risk, yet it was born of necessity, a calculated defiance against the cruelty that had shaped every aspect of her existence. As the first birdsong heralded a new day, she moved through the plantation with the practiced ease of someone who knew both the value of caution and the power of intention. Her heart carried both fear and exhilaration, the twin emotions that accompany acts of courage that challenge the very foundations of oppression. In this duality, Sarah found her strength, the knowledge that the act of resistance, even in its smallest form, could ripple outward, touching lives in ways that could not be anticipated but could be profoundly transformative. As summer approached, the heat bore down relentlessly on the fields, sweat soaking into the coarse cotton garments, stinging eyes and cracking lips, yet the labor continued without pause. Overseers rode along the dirt paths in the early morning, whips in hand, barking orders to keep the rhythm of toil unbroken. The weight of oppression pressed on every aspect of daily life, yet within this crucible Sarah's resolve hardened. She had learned to read the subtle cues of those who wielded power, the tightening of a jaw, the narrowing of eyes, the calculated silence before a lash fell. She understood that survival demanded more than obedience. It demanded observation, patience, and the ability to see the invisible threads of influence that bound every action to consequence. Each day, as she moved through the rows of cotton with practiced precision, her mind charted possibilities, noting weaknesses in the overseer's routines, vulnerabilities in the plantation's system of control, and opportunities for disruption that might arise in the rhythm of the fields. Sarah's life was marked by a constant tension between outward compliance and inner defiance. She performed every task as expected, turning soil, harvesting cotton, carrying water. But every movement was calculated, her body and spirit attuned to the undercurrents of danger and opportunity. Even the simplest gestures could betray intent. A glance too long, a hesitation in motion could draw scrutiny. She learned to mask her thoughts, to cloak determination beneath the surface of apparent subservience. This duality was exhausting, yet it was also empowering, providing her with a measure of control in a world designed to strip her of all agency. Within her, a fire of justice and self-assertion burned steadily, a beacon in the oppressive darkness shaping decisions and actions that might one day tip the balance of her own fate. In these months, Sarah cultivated alliances with others who shared her quiet determination. Among the enslaved community, she found individuals who, though constrained by fear and circumstance, had glimpsed the possibilities of resistance. There was Thomas, an older man whose hands were gnarled from decades of labor, but whose mind remained sharp, able to recall details about the movements of the overseers and the schedules of the plantation. With astonishing accuracy, he shared whispered knowledge of safe paths, hidden storerooms, and the weaknesses in the guards' vigilance. There was also Clara, a young woman whose courage rivaled Sarah's own, willing to take calculated risks to protect those in danger and to maintain morale among the enslaved. These connections were forged in secrecy, through quiet conversations under the cover of night, in the shadows of barns and among the dense reeds along the riverbanks. Each alliance strengthened Sarah's understanding of her environment and provided critical intelligence for the plan that had begun to take shape in her mind. The plantation records remained the ultimate symbol of control. Each ledger, each list of names, each notation of punishment or sale was a tangible manifestation of ownership, a bureaucratic chain that bound human lives to land and profit. Sarah understood that destroying these documents would not end the institution of slavery, but it would strike a profound psychological blow to those who wielded power on the plantation. It would erase the proof of ownership, disrupt the administrative control that kept families fragmented, and assert a form of agency that could not be ignored. The risk was extraordinary. Discovery meant brutal retribution, the lash, imprisonment, forced labor beyond ordinary limits or worse. Yet the vision of fire consuming the records became a beacon, a moment of poetic justice that crystallized her courage and sharpened her focus. Each day she moved closer to understanding how it could be accomplished, observing the placement of ledgers, the schedules of clerks, and the routines that made the plantation both a prison and a stage for defiance. Summer storms arrived with little warning, sudden and violent, drenching fields, washing away the dust and leaving deep pools of mud. For the enslaved, these storms were both an inconvenience and an opportunity. Labor slowed as rain rendered cotton picking nearly impossible. Overseers sheltered under the veranda or inside the house, and the rhythm of daily observation was disrupted. Sarah noticed these patterns, the ways that nature could tilt the balance, if only briefly, in favor of those who understood its rhythms. She began to consider the timing of her actions in relation to these storms, the gaps in vigilance they might produce, the moments when the plantation's rigid structures could be bent, if only for hours. These calculations became a form of strategy, a mental mapping of risk and opportunity, blending knowledge of human behavior, environmental conditions, and the layout of the land itself. As the days passed, Sarah also contended with the emotional weight of her plan. Resistance, even in its smallest form, carried consequences that extended beyond the individual. If caught, she knew her punishment would be cruel, but the repercussions could cascade outward, affecting friends, family, and those who had aided her in secret. The moral calculus was agonizing, yet she understood that inaction was also a form of complicity, a surrender of agency to the forces that had stolen her childhood, her freedom, and the lives of countless others. Each night she wrestled with fear, grief, and hope in equal measure, allowing each emotion to guide her understanding of what it meant to act in a world that had denied her so much. The fire that she envisioned consuming the plantation records was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a statement of defiance, an assertion that even in chains, the human spirit could resist, could reclaim, could imagine liberation. The presence of children on the plantation sharpened Sarah's awareness of stakes and legacy. She watched young ones, their small hands awkwardly plucking cotton. Their laughter and tears filtered through the lens of survival, learning lessons of obedience before they could speak fully, and internalizing the cruel hierarchies around them. Their innocence was a stark contrast to the harsh realities that surrounded them. And for Sarah, these children represented both vulnerability and hope. She felt a protective responsibility, not merely for herself but for the next generation, a desire to leave a mark of resistance that might ripple outward, a legacy of courage that transcended the immediate consequences of her actions. Every observation, every small act of guidance or subtle protection became a piece of the larger narrative she was weaving in her mind. a narrative of defiance, of survival, and of hope amidst unimaginable adversity. In the evenings, when the fields emptied and shadows lengthened across the plantation, Sarah moved with quiet purpose. She studied the layout of the main house, the location of the clerk's offices, the positioning of the ledgers and documents that constituted the administrative heart of the estate. Each detail mattered, the times when doors were left ajar, when candles burned low, when the sounds of the fields masked movement elsewhere. She memorized these patterns, committing them to memory with the precision of someone who understood that a single misstep could mean the difference between freedom and death. Her planning became ritualistic, a form of meditation in which each movement, each observation, and each decision was rehearsed mentally, refining the steps until they could be executed almost instinctively. By late summer, Sarah had mapped nearly every corner of the plantation in her mind. She knew where the overseers were likely to patrol, when the clerks would update records, and how the servants inside the house moved through the corridors. She had cultivated a network of trusted confidants among the enslaved, each of whom provided critical intelligence and emotional support, and had carefully considered the consequences of any action that might alert the masters. The plan was dangerous, the stakes unimaginably high, yet the clarity of purpose she had cultivated over months of observation, reflection, and subtle resistance made the act feel both inevitable and necessary. In her mind, the destruction of the plantation records was no longer merely symbolic. It was a moral imperative, a declaration that even in chains, human dignity and courage could not be extinguished. The first signs of autumn brought a cooling of the air, but an intensification of vigilance among the overseers. Whispers of potential unrest had reached the master's ears, carried along the river by travelers and messengers from neighboring plantations. Suspicion hardened into scrutiny, and every movement of the enslaved was watched more closely, every gathering more carefully monitored. Sarah adapted to these changes, adjusting her observations, her movements, and her timing with meticulous care. The awareness that danger had increased sharpened her focus, transforming fear into clarity. Every step of the plan, every potential misstep, every variable became a point of attention, a reminder that courage was inseparable from vigilance, and that the price of failure would be immediate and brutal. Amid this environment, Sarah drew strength from the small, quiet moments of humanity around her. The hushed conversations at night, the shared songs of sorrow and hope, the small acts of kindness among those who had learned to survive together. All of these reinforced the moral and emotional stakes of her plan. She understood that resistance was never only an individual act. It was embedded within the networks of solidarity that existed quietly, invisibly, among the enslaved. Each ally, each confidant, each moment of shared courage strengthened the possibility that her act of defiance could succeed, that it could become more than a single fire-consuming paper, but a symbolic assertion of agency that would resonate across the fields, across time, across the lives of those who remained bound, yet unbroken. As the first leaves of autumn began to fall, turning the edges of the cotton fields to shades of amber and gold, the plantation hummed with the unchanging rhythm of labor and surveillance. Yet beneath this veneer of order, Sarah's mind was alight with the meticulous plotting that had consumed months of careful observation and reflection. Every overseer's route, every clerk's schedule, every routine that dictated the lives of the enslaved had been memorized and analyzed. She carried within her the knowledge that a single misstep could cost not only her life, but those of her confidants, yet the urgency of defiance outweighed the dangers. The act she contemplated was both symbolic and practical. The destruction of the plantation records, the very documents that tethered human lives to ownership, a fire that could erase the written proof of bondage and assert a form of agency that even the most vigilant masters could not immediately reclaim. Sarah's preparations were conducted in secrecy, each movement carefully calculated to avoid detection. She explored hidden corners of the main house under the guise of labor, studied the placement of ledgers, and memorized the locks and keys that secured them. The small network she had built among the enslaved community became her eyes and ears, sharing information about guard rotations, the movements of the master's family, and the rare moments when the house fell into quiet stillness. These allies were bound by trust and necessity, each aware of the stakes, each understanding the potential cost of discovery. In their whispered conversations beneath the cover of night, They traded knowledge and encouragement, the bonds of solidarity growing stronger as the plan coalesced. The clandestine alliance was more than a practical necessity. It was a shared moral and emotional commitment, a declaration that, even in the most oppressive circumstances, human dignity could assert itself. The plantation itself became a labyrinth of opportunity and danger. The main house, with its wide verandas and polished floors, was a fortress of oversight, yet its very size and complexity offered concealed spaces that could be exploited. Storage rooms, shadowed hallways, and servants' passages were studied with painstaking attention, revealing roots and vulnerabilities that the masters and overseers assumed were secure. Sarah practiced moving through these spaces in her mind and in brief, undetected trials, refining her movements until they became instinctual. Each step, each timing, each pause was rehearsed mentally, a choreography of risk and opportunity, guided by both intelligence and intuition. In her calculations, she accounted not only for the positions of human guards but for the unpredictable variables of nature. The creak of a floorboard, the flicker of candlelight, the whisper of wind through the eaves, any one of which could betray her presence. Beyond the physical landscape, Sarah contended with the emotional and moral weight of her plan. The destruction of the records was not merely tactical. It was a statement of resistance, a challenge to the system that had stolen childhoods, families, and futures. She reflected on the lives erased from history, the mothers and fathers who had never seen their children grow, the children who would never know the warmth of familial love, all catalogued in the pages she intended to burn. These reflections were both a burden and a source of determination, fueling her courage and sharpening her awareness that the act she contemplated was not only personal, but communal, a gesture on behalf of those whose stories were confined to ledger entries in memory. Every evening, as darkness fell over the fields and the last workers returned from labor, Sarah allowed herself brief moments of reflection, holding in her mind both the grief of the past and the hope that action could ignite change. As she prepared, Sarah also considered the potential responses from the master and his agents. Plantation life was maintained by fear, and any disruption would trigger swift and brutal consequences. Punishments for insubordination were harsh and public, designed to deter others and reinforce the hierarchy. She weighed these dangers carefully, understanding that the fire she planned could provoke a wave of retribution. Yet within her, the logic of resistance outweighed the fear of consequence. The destruction of the records would not end slavery, but it would disrupt its mechanisms, assert the presence of agency, and serve as a symbolic act that could inspire courage, even quietly, in others who labored under oppression. The awareness of risk heightened her resolve, each moment of contemplation sharpening both strategy and moral clarity. The physical act of resistance demanded coordination, timing, and courage. Sarah had identified the moments when the clerks were least vigilant, when the master was absent or distracted, and when the guards' patrols offered gaps that could be exploited. She practiced mental simulations, imagining the sequence of movement from the cotton fields to the house, the careful entry into the storage rooms, and the handling of documents. Each scenario was considered in full detail. What to do if a door creaked, if a candle flickered, if footsteps approached unexpectedly. These rehearsals were exhausting yet essential. They transformed fear into preparedness and provided a sense of control in a world designed to deny it. The act of planning itself became an assertion of power, a quiet rebellion against the systemic control that had defined every aspect of her existence. Within the enslaved community, anticipation and anxiety mingled with loyalty and hope. Thomas, the older man who had become her mentor, offered both practical guidance and moral support, recounting tales of past acts of defiance and escape, illustrating how courage had manifested in subtle yet powerful ways. Clara, equally resolute, shared observations about the guards' movements and strategies to mislead them. Together, they provided a framework for collaboration, each contributing knowledge and insight that increased the likelihood of success. Their cooperation was an act of solidarity, a statement that the enslaved were not merely passive victims but active agents capable of shaping their environment, even under extreme constraints. Sarah's preparation also required careful management of her own psychological state. Fear, while natural, could cloud judgment and increase the likelihood of error. She developed strategies to manage anxiety, focusing on breath, visualization, and the rhythmic repetition of her mental rehearsals. She reminded herself constantly of the purpose behind her actions, to reclaim a measure of agency, to assert moral defiance, and to protect those who could not act for themselves. These meditative practices were not only tactical but symbolic, reinforcing the inner strength that had carried her from childhood through years of labor and observation. Each night as she lay in the shadows of the quarters, listening to the whispered songs of hope and mourning, she drew sustenance from both memory and imagination, understanding that the courage required to act was as much internal as it was external. As the day of action approached, the tension in the air was palpable. The rhythm of labor continued outwardly unchanged, yet beneath it anticipation crackled. Sarah moved with heightened awareness, noting every shift in oversight, every moment of distraction, every vulnerability that might provide a fleeting opportunity. Her allies shared information discreetly, confirming patrol patterns, gaps in vigilance, and signs of possible interference. Each piece of intelligence was integrated into a mental map that grew increasingly precise. A strategy informed by months of observation, reflection, and cautious experimentation. The careful cultivation of knowledge, patience, and collaboration had brought her to this moment, the precipice of action that carried both immense risk and the possibility of a profound assertion of agency. Finally, on an evening when the sun dipped low behind distant trees and shadows stretched across the plantation, Sarah recognized a convergence of circumstances that offered an opening. The clerks had departed for a late meeting in the town center. The overseers were preoccupied with the last stages of harvest, and the master himself was engaged in correspondence elsewhere. The house, typically a fortress of scrutiny, fell briefly into quiet stillness. Sarah felt a mixture of exhilaration and fear, the culmination of months of preparation narrowing into a single window of opportunity. Every movement she would make in the coming hours would need to be precise, deliberate, and unyielding. The weight of the moment pressed upon her, yet within that weight lay the crystallization of purpose. The fire she envisioned would not only destroy records, but would stand as a testament to courage, defiance, and the unbroken spirit of those who had been denied their freedom. The night had fallen fully over the plantation, draping the cotton fields in a heavy, suffocating darkness that seemed to absorb sound and light alike. Lanterns burned low in the main house, casting flickering shadows across polished floors and the high ceilings of rooms that bore witness to decades of human suffering. Sarah moved quietly, each step measured, each breath controlled, attuned to the rhythms of the night. The months of observation, mental rehearsals, and whispered coordination with her allies had brought her to this singular moment. The plantation, which had for so long been a theater of oppression, now became the stage for her act of defiance. Every detail mattered. The creak of a floorboard, the snap of a shutter in the wind, the subtle footfalls of a patrolling overseer. One miscalculation could unravel the plan and seal her fate. Yet within her, a fire of determination burned brighter than any fear, a force cultivated over years of labor, loss, and quiet resistance. The first step required moving unseen through spaces that were both familiar and dangerous. Sarah had memorized the layout of the main house to a degree that made her movements almost instinctual. She navigated hallways that had been the domain of masters and overseers for decades, passages that bore the weight of their authority, yet in this moment became avenues of liberation. The air carried the scent of waxed wood, candle smoke, and the faintly metallic tang of ink on paper. The very records she had targeted lay ahead, repositories of human lives catalogued for profit. Her pulse quickened, but she maintained the precision that months of preparation had instilled, blending patience with resolve. Each shadow, each sound, each breath was assessed, evaluated, and integrated into her unfolding plan. An intricate choreography that demanded both courage and ingenuity. The ledgers themselves rested in a room that was usually locked and guarded, the centerpiece of the master's control over the plantation. Sarah had observed the clerk's routine repeatedly, noting the times when the room was unattended, the manner in which keys were handled, and the brief moments when oversight was lax. Now, as she approached the door, she felt the weight of the night pressing down upon her, the gravity of her intended action crystallizing into every nerve and muscle. The lock, though simple by the standards of the house, represented a symbolic threshold. Crossing it would mark the transition from preparation to execution, from possibility to reality. With practiced hands and a careful touch, she manipulated the key she had borrowed from a sympathetic servant, turning it slowly, deliberately, as though each second stretched into eternity. The door yielded and she slipped inside, swallowed by the dim glow of the candlelight that barely illuminated the rows of documents before her. Every ledger was a testament to human suffering, a silent record of lives constrained, broken, and commodified. The names etched upon the pages represented mothers, fathers, children, human beings reduced to entries and numbers, their stories overwritten by the ledger's cold authority. Sarah felt a surge of emotion, grief and righteous anger intertwining, fueling the courage she had cultivated over years. She touched the paper lightly, feeling the texture, the weight of history embedded in every line. In her mind, she visualized fire consuming these pages, the act erasing both the physical evidence of ownership and the psychological chains imposed upon her and her community. It was a dangerous, symbolic, and profoundly human act, a moment where moral courage intersected with tactical acumen. As she prepared the kindling she had brought, her thoughts wandered briefly to those who had guided her. Thomas, whose wisdom had been a compass through the treacherous landscape of plantation life. Clara, whose courage mirrored her own, and the many others who had lent their knowledge, trust, and hope to the endeavor. This act was not hers alone. It was a collective assertion of defiance, a manifestation of courage shared among those who had survived, who had watched, who had endured the constant erosion of dignity and family. Each piece of kindling, each careful placement of combustible material, was infused with these collective memories, transforming the physical act into a symbolic eruption of resistance. The first spark was small, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the potential to unravel the meticulous order maintained by the plantation. Sarah watched as the flame caught, licking the edges of paper that had once defined the lives of so many. The soft crackle of burning ink and parchment was almost inaudible beneath the night's ambient sounds, yet it reverberated through her entire being. Each ledger consumed was a reclamation of humanity, an assertion that even within the mechanisms of oppression, courage and agency could prevail. The fire grew steadily, and with it, Sarah felt a surge of empowerment, tempered by the acute awareness of the peril that now surrounded her. Every movement had to be precise, every breath controlled, as the act that had consumed months of planning unfolded in real time. The shadows of the room seemed to dance in tandem with the flames, reflecting the duality of her endeavor, danger intertwined with liberation, fear coupled with courage. The plantation, which had for so long been a symbol of absolute control, now trembled under the weight of her quiet rebellion. Sarah worked methodically, ensuring that the fire consumed the records without revealing her presence prematurely, using her knowledge of airflow, candle placement, and the layout of the room to control both visibility and risk. Her mind remained acutely aware of every sound outside the room, every creak of a floorboard, every distant call from the fields, integrating these variables into her ongoing assessment of danger. The act was both physical and intellectual, a convergence of instinct, preparation, and moral resolve. As the night deepened, the first hints of smoke began to curl toward the ceiling, a sign that the destruction was well underway. Sarah's heart raced, but she maintained the composure that months of meticulous rehearsal had instilled. The fire symbolized more than the destruction of paper. It was a statement to those who would follow, a signal that resistance was possible even in the most constrained circumstances. Each ledger reduced to ashes was a strike against the machinery of oppression, a declaration that the enslaved were not merely objects of ownership, but sentient beings capable of courage, ingenuity, and defiance. Her thoughts briefly turned to the master and overseers. Should they discover the destruction, they would respond with violence, yet the risk was inseparable from the act of moral resistance. Courage, she reminded herself, required acknowledgement of danger and the willingness to act regardless. The hours passed in an intense blend of concentration, fear, and exhilaration. Sarah worked with precision, attending to the fire, monitoring its spread, and ensuring that the act remained controlled enough to avoid immediate detection. Her body ached from months of labor, yet adrenaline and purpose sustained her through each movement. In this crucible, she experienced a convergence of emotion: grief for those whose lives had been catalogued and commodified, anger at the cruelty and injustice she had endured, and hope that her act might reverberate beyond the immediate destruction. Every flicker of flame represented both the literal and symbolic reclamation of power, a moment in which the enslaved could assert agency against the pervasive system that sought to deny it. Outside the room, The plantation remained unaware of the quiet rebellion unfolding within its walls. The night sounds, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, distant barking of dogs provided cover, blending with the soft crackle of burning paper. Sarah's awareness extended to every element of her environment, integrating observation and intuition in real time. She anticipated potential interruptions, the unexpected presence of an overseer, a servant checking the rooms, the master himself emerging from his quarters. Every contingency had been rehearsed mentally, and now the rehearsal transformed into action. With each ledger consumed, her confidence grew, yet so too did the stakes, as the fire's presence increased the likelihood of detection with each passing moment. By the time the first hints of dawn approached, Sarah had achieved what she had envisioned. The plantation records, painstakingly maintained over decades, lay in ashes. The act was complete, yet the night's labor had left her drained, exhilarated, and acutely aware of the consequences that might follow. She had struck a blow against the system of control, asserted her agency, and performed an act of moral and symbolic defiance that could never be erased. Yet the fire, while a moment of triumph, also signaled the beginning of a new phase. The need for evasion, the management of suspicion, and the negotiation of consequences in a world still ruled by violence, fear, and ownership. As she slipped back through the hallways, retracing steps that had been memorized with painstaking care, Sarah felt the dual weight of relief and anticipation. The plantation, once a symbol of absolute control, had been shaken if only momentarily. The act of defiance would not end slavery, but it had demonstrated in tangible and dramatic form that courage, planning, and moral resolve could disrupt even the most rigid system of oppression. Each step back to the quarters was both a return to relative safety and a meditation on the power of resistance, the risks inherent in asserting one's humanity, and the possibility that acts of defiance, however small or localized, could ripple outward, inspiring others, preserving dignity and reclaiming agency in a world designed to deny it. The first light of morning crept slowly across the Mississippi Delta, casting pale illumination over fields still glistening with dew. The rhythm of labor began as usual, yet an undercurrent of unease rippled through the plantation. Whispers moved like currents among the enslaved, subtle glances exchanged that carried the unspoken question. Had last night's events gone unnoticed? Sarah felt a weight in her chest, the dual burdens of triumph and fear pressing heavily against her ribs. She moved among the rows of cotton with practiced composure, concealing the adrenaline that still coursed through her veins, aware that the slightest hint of her previous night's actions could invite deadly repercussions. The fire that had consumed the plantation records was no longer just an act of defiance. It was now a fragile secret, suspended precariously between revelation and silence. By mid-morning, the master's household began to stir with the first signs of recognition. The absence of the clerks at dawn, the faint smell of smoke lingering near the offices, and the slight chaos in the counting room hinted at an irregularity, though none could yet grasp the full scope. Overseers tightened their vigilance, eyes scanning every movement of the enslaved, hands flexing nervously near whips and tools of punishment. Sarah, ever observant, noted these changes with a measured calm. She recognized that her act had disrupted the meticulously maintained hierarchy, and the tension now crackled like electricity through the air. Every glance from the overseers, every sudden halt in movement among her fellow laborers, seemed amplified, a reminder that the plantation existed as both stage and battlefield, with consequences poised to fall upon any misstep. The enslaved community responded to the morning's tension with a mixture of fear and quiet solidarity. Rumors spread like murmured currents. A clerk had discovered the remnants of ashes in the storage room, a key had been found slightly askew, and the ledgers that once defined human lives had vanished into smoke. Each person interpreted the signs through their own lens of experience, balancing hope with dread, recognizing both the audacity of the act and the possible repercussions. Sarah observed them closely, noting their reactions, understanding that fear was contagious but also that courage could ripple outward if guided carefully. Her presence, calm yet vigilant, became a subtle anchor, reminding those around her that acts of resistance, though fraught with danger, could also assert humanity in the face of systemic oppression. The master returned to the main house mid-morning, the first flicker of suspicion igniting in his eyes as he surveyed the office. The meticulous records, the ledger pages that had catalogued his dominion over human lives, were gone. Panic, frustration, and rage intermingled in his expression, though he attempted to maintain a semblance of control before the overseers and other household staff. Whispers of sabotage began circulating, yet no evidence pointed clearly to any individual. The absence of proof, combined with the meticulous care Sarah had taken, left the plantation in a liminal state of uncertainty. The power hierarchy remained intact outwardly, but the invisible threads that bound it had been momentarily loosened. Sarah observed from a distance, her heart pounding not with pride alone, but with the acute awareness that the act had shifted the balance of fear, suspicion, and authority in subtle but profound ways. As the day progressed, the master's frustration grew. He summoned overseers and clerks, demanding explanations for the missing records, scrutinizing every shadow, questioning every person. The enslaved, meanwhile, continued their labor with a wary caution, understanding that detection could result in severe punishment. In the fields, Sarah moved with an outward calm that masked a turbulent interior, her mind racing through contingency plans, evaluating every signal, every glance, every potential breach of secrecy. She understood that her act of defiance had unleashed not only immediate risk, but also a psychological shift in the plantation's dynamics. The master no longer possessed the same unquestioned authority, and the enslaved community, even in fear, had witnessed the tangible impact of courage. Thomas and Clara, her confidants, provided subtle reassurance as the day unfolded. In quiet moments, when overseers were distracted, or when work allowed for brief pauses, they exchanged discreet nods or gestures, acknowledging that the plan had succeeded. These small acknowledgments carried immense emotional weight. They were signs of survival, of solidarity, and of the shared recognition that even within a system designed to erase agency, human will could assert itself decisively. Each glance reinforced the lesson that courage was not only a solitary act, but a communal force, capable of resonating through collective understanding and shared experience. Sarah drew strength from these connections, understanding that while the immediate danger remained, the moral victory of the act would endure. Meanwhile, the destruction of the records had practical consequences that rippled throughout the plantation. Without the meticulous documentation, the process of asserting ownership, tracking debts, and maintaining control became suddenly more cumbersome. Overseers and clerks scrambled to reconstruct the information from memory and oral accounts, a chaotic process that highlighted the fragility of systems built on paper rather than human equity. The enslaved community observed this disruption with a mixture of cautious optimism and awareness of potential retaliation. For Sarah, these tangible effects reinforced the symbolic power of her actions. The destruction of documents had not only asserted personal defiance, but also revealed the vulnerabilities inherent in the structures of control that governed their lives. As afternoon approached, the master's anger began to translate into punitive measures. Though no immediate culprit could be identified, overseers increased their presence in the fields, monitoring every movement with a vigilance intensified by suspicion. Yet the act had already sown subtle cracks in the plantation's hierarchy. The enslaved, while outwardly compliant, were aware that an individual among them had dared to challenge authority and succeed. The psychological effect was profound, an invisible assertion of agency that could not be contained by whips, punishment, or fear alone. Sarah moved through these heightened tensions with cautious precision, attuned to every signal, every glance, every shift in behavior that might indicate detection or danger. Throughout the day, Sarah reflected on the larger implications of her act. While the destruction of records would not dismantle the institution of slavery, it represented a moral and symbolic victory that transcended immediate circumstances. Each ledger reduced to ashes was a reclamation of human dignity, a refusal to be catalogued, controlled, or erased. She understood that acts of defiance, even localized and ephemeral, carried the potential to inspire others, to challenge assumptions of passivity, and to assert the presence of agency where it was least expected. The fire, both literal and metaphorical, illuminated a truth that the plantation had long sought to suppress, that even in the most constrained conditions, courage could manifest, ripple outward, and assert itself against structures of oppression. As evening fell, Sarah found herself momentarily alone, retreating to the shadows of the quarters to rest and gather strength. The day had been exhausting, a delicate dance of observation, calculation, and emotional endurance. Yet she also recognized the quiet victories. The plantation had been unsettled, authority disrupted, and a collective understanding among the enslaved had shifted. The act of burning the records was now embedded in the communal memory, an event that, though dangerous and secretive, had tangible consequences for both oppressors and oppressed. Sarah allowed herself a brief moment of reflection, considering the lives affected, the courage required, and the lessons embedded in the night's defiance. By the time darkness returned, the plantation had settled into a tense, uneasy quiet. The overseers remained vigilant, the master frustrated and fearful, and the enslaved community aware that their world had shifted in subtle but profound ways. Sarah, weary but resolute, prepared for the nights to come, understanding that vigilance and careful navigation of suspicion were now critical. Yet within her a sense of quiet triumph endured. The destruction of the records was a moment of agency, courage, and moral clarity, a statement that even in chains, human spirit could assert itself, disrupt systems of control, and illuminate possibilities for resistance. The days following the destruction of the plantation records unfolded with a tension so palpable that it seemed to seep into every corner of the estate. Overseers prowled the fields with a vigilance sharpened by uncertainty, eyes scanning every movement as if expecting the very earth to betray the perpetrator. The master, his anger simmering beneath a veneer of control, summoned those he considered trustworthy to account for the inexplicable loss, demanding explanations, reprimanding clerks, and attempting to reassert dominance through fear. Each inquiry, each raised voice, and each threatening glance was a reminder that the plantation was both a physical and psychological instrument of control, and that defiance, however courageous, carried consequences that could ripple far beyond the individual. Sarah, moving among the laborers with careful attention, felt the subtle shifts in atmosphere, the tightening of bodies under scrutiny, the careful modulation of speech, the unspoken calculations of risk and allegiance that now governed every interaction. Sarah's own mind, however, was occupied not solely with evasion, but with the moral and emotional dimensions of what she had accomplished. She understood that the act of burning the records, while materially destructive, was also a profound assertion of human dignity, a statement that ownership could not extinguish spirit, that fear alone could not fully contain the will to resist. She reflected on the long months of preparation, the alliances she had cultivated, and the mental fortitude required to carry out the act, recognizing that courage was as much an internal discipline as it was an external performance. The fire had consumed not merely paper, but the symbolic chains that bound lives to the ledger, and in doing so, it had revealed the latent power of agency even within extreme oppression. Yet this realization was inseparable from the acute awareness of risk. Discovery could mean death, mutilation, or prolonged suffering, and Sarah knew that the master's response would be merciless if evidence were ever traced to her. Within the enslaved community, the repercussions of the act reverberated quietly. Thomas and Clara, her closest allies, shared subtle gestures of recognition and solidarity, small acts that carried immense psychological significance. The destruction of the records had become more than a practical disruption. It was a catalyst for a shift in perception, an assertion that courage could exist alongside fear, and that even under conditions designed to erase autonomy, human will could manifest decisively. Among the other enslaved, the story circulated cautiously, filtered through whispers and fleeting glances, each retelling emphasizing the audacity of the act and the possibility of agency. This collective consciousness, while cautious and measured, began to foster a subtle empowerment, a recognition that resistance was conceivable even in the shadow of overwhelming authority. Meanwhile, the master's scrutiny intensified, his frustration giving way to paranoia. He inspected every room, questioned every individual, and demanded loyalty with an intensity that verged on hysteria. Overseers, eager to curry favor and avoid suspicion themselves, extended their vigilance into relentless observation, noting even the smallest deviations from routine. Laborers were forced to recount their work in minute detail, and rumors of informants circulated like an undercurrent of fear. The plantation, normally governed by routine and predictable control, had shifted into a state of hyper-awareness, each day a test of composure, secrecy, and endurance. Sarah navigated this heightened tension with deliberate calm. Her mental rehearsals of evasion and contingency activated continuously, each observation and assessment guiding movement and strategy. Amid this atmosphere of fear, Sarah contended with the emotional toll of secrecy. Every interaction, every gesture, every glance had to be calculated, monitored, and performed within a framework that maintained safety while preserving morale. The constant vigilance required to avoid detection weighed heavily, pressing on both mind and body. Sleep came in short, fragmented bursts, punctuated by dreams that echoed the danger and the stakes of the preceding night. Yet within these trials, Sarah drew strength from her convictions, reminding herself of the moral imperative that had guided her actions and the symbolic resonance of the fire that had consumed the plantation records. Courage, she realized, was inseparable from endurance, from the ability to navigate fear without relinquishing agency or identity. The search for the culprit became increasingly methodical and relentless. Overseers devised tests of loyalty, monitoring for inconsistencies in speech, hesitation in labor, or unusual behavior. The master relied on both intimidation and reward to provoke confession or betrayal, a strategy designed to fracture solidarity and isolate individuals. Sarah, acutely aware of the psychological mechanisms in play, modulated her behavior with precision, avoiding any action that could draw suspicion while observing patterns that might indicate which strategies were most likely to expose or conceal activity. She maintained her network of confidants who shared intelligence discreetly, reinforcing a collective awareness that allowed the act of defiance to remain hidden while simultaneously supporting morale among those most vulnerable to scrutiny. The emotional stakes for Sarah deepened as she considered the broader implications of her actions. The fire had been a personal assertion of agency, yet it had also transformed into a communal event, shaping the perceptions, hopes, and fears of the enslaved community. Families whispered about the audacity required to challenge authority. Children absorbed the tension and the lessons of courage, and adults contemplated the possibilities of resistance even under extreme constraint. Sarah's awareness of this ripple effect heightened both the sense of responsibility and the weight of consequence. Every move she made, every choice to remain silent or to guide others subtly, became a meditation on the ethical dimensions of defiance, a recognition that courage must be tempered by strategy, foresight, and moral clarity. In the privacy of her quarters, Sarah reflected on the months of preparation and the night of the fire. Considering both the technical execution and the moral dimensions of her action, the fire had been controlled, precise, and symbolic, yet it had also created a dynamic of uncertainty that left the plantation in a liminal state between order and chaos. The master's authority, though outwardly intact, had been challenged in a way that could not be ignored or undone. The overseers, while vigilant, were forced to confront the reality that their surveillance was not absolute, that even under extreme control, acts of defiance could occur. These realizations, while gratifying, were tempered by the ongoing necessity of caution, observation, and strategic navigation. Survival required both courage and prudence, a duality that Sarah carried with unwavering focus. As days turned into weeks, the plantation settled into a tense equilibrium. The ledgers remained destroyed, the official records lost, and the master's ability to assert complete control weakened by uncertainty. Yet the risk of discovery lingered constantly, a shadow over every movement and interaction. Sarah continued to labor with outward compliance, integrating careful observation with subtle strategies to mislead potential suspicion. She understood that endurance was as critical as courage. The act itself was only the first step, and survival, the protection of allies, and the maintenance of secrecy were essential to realizing the broader significance of her defiance. The plantation had been destabilized, if only slightly, and Sarah's careful attention ensured that the disruption persisted without immediate personal catastrophe. Within the enslaved community, the story of the fire evolved into a shared narrative of courage, resilience, and moral assertion. Even those who had not witnessed the act firsthand internalized the message that resistance was possible, that agency could manifest even under extreme duress, and that the human spirit could assert itself against the machinery of oppression. These psychological shifts, subtle yet profound, created a dynamic in which fear coexisted with empowerment, and where acts of moral courage carried resonance far beyond their immediate physical consequences. Sarah's presence, her vigilance, and her moral clarity became both a beacon and a protective force, guiding others in a complex web of survival, resistance, and quiet assertion of humanity. Weeks had passed since the fire consumed the plantation records, and yet the plantation remained charged with the residual tension of uncertainty. The master, his authority shaken though outwardly unbroken, had attempted to restore order through both intimidation and meticulous oversight, but the absence of the ledgers left gaps in the meticulous hierarchy he depended upon. Overseers moved with rigid vigilance, eyes scanning fields and quarters, hands ever close to tools of punishment, yet their efforts were shadowed by the invisible act that had already disrupted the fabric of control. Among the enslaved, whispers of courage circulated with renewed intensity, cautious glances and subtle gestures conveying acknowledgement, solidarity, and hope. Sarah, moving deliberately through the fields and quarters, remained acutely aware of the balance she had struck between action and survival, defiance and discretion. Each day was a study in vigilance, her every movement measured, her awareness of eyes and ears constant, yet her spirit sustained by the knowledge that the act of destruction had irreversibly asserted human agency. Sarah reflected often on the moral weight of her act. Destroying the ledgers had been more than a tactical disruption. It had been a reclamation of dignity. Each name that had been reduced to an entry on paper, each life catalogued and controlled, had been symbolically liberated through fire. She thought of the mothers who had labored from dawn to dusk, their bodies broken but their will unyielding, and of the children who had grown up under the shadow of forced labor, learning the language of survival and silence. The fire, small and localized as it was, became a symbolic conflagration that transcended immediate destruction, an assertion that even in chains, the human spirit could act decisively. In moments of solitude, she meditated on the paradox of her courage. The act itself carried risk of reprisal, yet it also illuminated the resilience and intelligence embedded in lives that were too often denied recognition. Courage, she understood, was inseparable from both risk and consequence. The moral weight of action existed alongside the practical imperatives of survival. The master's reaction evolved with each passing day. Frustration and anger, initially sharp and explosive, had begun to give way to a more calculated approach. He sought to identify the instigator through subtle surveillance, testing loyalty, and probing for inconsistencies. Overseers were instructed to monitor behavior with increased scrutiny, to note hesitation, deviation, or unusual observation, and to report anything deemed suspicious. Punishments were meted out swiftly when any minor infraction occurred, a strategy intended to reinforce fear and discourage collective solidarity. Yet the absence of records continued to gnaw at the structural control of the plantation. Every attempt to reconstruct information from memory was flawed, revealing the limitations of authority dependent on paper and routine, rather than human equity and consent. Sarah watched these developments with a quiet, measured awareness, recognizing that the symbolic and practical consequences of her action extended far beyond the immediate night of the fire. Within the enslaved community, the psychological impact of Sarah's act deepened over time. Stories circulated discreetly, carried through whispered conversations in the fields and kitchens, and in the hidden corners of quarters. The narrative emphasized courage, ingenuity, and moral clarity, highlighting the possibility of resistance even under extreme oppression. Children learned to observe and imitate subtle strategies of discretion. Adults considered the implications of collective solidarity, and a cautious but tangible sense of empowerment began to emerge. Sarah's presence, both physical and symbolic, provided a focal point for this evolving consciousness. She had demonstrated that courage could coexist with prudence, that defiance could be both effective and morally resonant, and that the assertion of agency was possible even within the most constrained circumstances. The fire, once a singular event, had transformed into a touchstone of collective awareness, a moment that embedded itself in the memories and imagination of those who had witnessed its aftermath. Yet the act of defiance also carried its own burdens. Sarah remained vigilant at all times, acutely aware of the possibility that suspicion might eventually crystallize into accusation. Every glance from an overseer, every subtle shift in behavior among her peers, was analyzed for potential threat. Sleep was fractured, punctuated by dreams that mirrored the tension of the days. Flames consuming more than paper, the master's fury manifested in distorted forms, the fragile networks of trust threatened by betrayal. These psychological pressures were compounded by the moral responsibility she felt toward her allies. The act of rebellion, while her own initiative had implicated others in its execution, even if only indirectly, and she carried the weight of that knowledge with quiet dignity and solemn resolve. Survival required both courage and careful calculation. Moral clarity demanded acknowledgement of consequence and a commitment to act with discretion and integrity. Despite the risks, Sarah also recognized the broader significance of her act. The destruction of the records, though localized in space and immediate effect, challenged the assumption that control could ever be absolute. It demonstrated that, even within a system meticulously constructed to suppress humanity, agency could assert itself, and that moral courage had tangible consequences that could ripple outward. The master's inability to fully restore order or reconstruct the lost information revealed the fragility inherent in systems dependent upon coercion and documentation rather than consent. The enslaved community, meanwhile, internalized these lessons in ways both subtle and profound. The fire had provided proof that even the most entrenched structures could be challenged, that hope could be kindled in the face of fear, and that the assertion of dignity, however perilous, could leave an enduring mark. Over time, the plantation fell into a tentative equilibrium. The immediate chaos of the fire had subsided, the master's authority outwardly reasserted, and overseers resumed daily routines with renewed intensity. Yet beneath this surface order, the subtle shift in consciousness persisted. Sarah, now, a figure of quiet reverence and cautious admiration, continued to labor alongside her peers, her presence a reminder of the possibilities inherent in courage, discretion, and moral clarity. The memory of the fire became part of the collective narrative, a lesson whispered from one generation to the next, illustrating that even under conditions of extreme oppression, human agency could not be fully extinguished. The act of burning. The records had become more than a tactical event. It was a moral statement, a symbolic reclamation of dignity, and a manifestation of the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit. In reflecting on her experience, Sarah understood that the fire was both a literal and figurative illumination. It had revealed vulnerabilities in structures of power, demonstrated the potential for strategic resistance, and underscored the moral imperative to assert agency in the face of injustice. Yet it had also revealed the weight of consequence, the ongoing need for vigilance, the emotional toll of secrecy, and the intricate balance between courage and prudence. Survival required awareness, foresight, and restraint. Morality required reflection, empathy, and a commitment to collective responsibility. The fire had been a catalyst, igniting both physical and psychological change, and its effects would resonate long after the flames had died, shaping perceptions, guiding behavior, and reinforcing the possibility of resistance in a world structured to suppress it. In the months and years that followed, Sarah's story persisted as a quiet legend among the enslaved. Though never officially recorded in the master's accounts, the tale of the fire, the audacity, and the moral courage of the woman who had dared to defy authority became embedded in communal memory. Children learned of her bravery and whispered lessons. Adults recounted the story with a mixture of admiration and solemnity, and the narrative of resistance shaped strategies of survival, solidarity, and moral assertion. Sarah herself continued to live cautiously, aware of the fragile balance between recognition and exposure. Yet she drew strength from the enduring truth that her act had irreversibly challenged the system of control, asserting that human will, intelligence, and moral courage could not be fully extinguished by ownership or fear. Ultimately, Sarah's act of defiance was more than a single night of courage. It was a testament to the enduring power of agency under oppression. The fire she ignited destroyed more than records. It ignited awareness, inspired hope, and demonstrated that even in conditions designed to suppress identity, courage could manifest, consequences could be navigated, and dignity could be reclaimed. Her story stands as a reminder that resistance, even when perilous and partial, has the capacity to disrupt structures of power, affirm humanity, and leave a legacy that transcends immediate circumstance. The flames that consumed the ledgers were gone, but their symbolic resonance endured. A quiet, unyielding assertion that human courage, moral clarity, and resilience persist even in the darkest corners of history.